The vast majority of Protestant churches are either beautiful but liberal, or conservative but ugly. How did this happen? Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where we build churches in Minecraft while talking about Christianity. So I'm gonna talk about why Protestantism is in such a bad place today. It seems that every Protestant church is either traditional in its style but liberal in its beliefs, or traditional in its beliefs but very modern and contemporary and ugly in its style. And it's rare to find a Protestant church that's both traditional in its style and traditional in its beliefs. Now, I do have a map of Protestant churches that are both traditional and conservative in every sense, and you can find that map linked in the description of this video, but the reason such a map is necessary is because it's a rare thing, and it shouldn't be rare, but it is. So we have to talk about why that is, and that's really because Protestantism has been split in half into two types of Protestant churches that both only really have half of the big picture, because it didn't used to be like this. Protestantism used to be just like Catholicism in that the vast majority of its churches were both beautiful buildings and also preached traditional Nicene Christianity. Of course, I think that Protestantism is the most faithful and biblical expression of Christianity. But recently, in the 20th century, Protestantism was completely split in half into mainline Protestantism and evangelical Protestantism. And these two different types of Protestantism have a different idea of what it means to be the church. And I'll explain that, but these categories of mainline and evangelical are not exactly different denominations, because you will have Presbyterians who are mainline and Presbyterians who are evangelical. Now, what is the difference between mainline and evangelical? So, generally, what you'll hear from the media, what you'll hear from most people, is that mainline equals liberal, and evangelical equals conservative, and this is true to a great extent. This is true like 9 out of 10 times, but not exactly, because I am definitely not liberal, but I am a mainline Protestant. I'm not an evangelical Protestant. I'm going to explain what I think the real difference between mainline and evangelical is. So, objectively, the difference comes from history, because the mainline Protestant churches are just the old ones, the traditional ones. I know that the mainline Presbyterian Church, the PCUSA, was founded pretty recently, but it was just a merger of previously existing denominations. Same thing with the United Methodist Church. It came into existence in the 60s, but it wasn't like all those churches sprouted out of nowhere. It was a union of many previous Methodist denominations. So basically, the mainline denominations, the mainline Protestant churches, are the ones with the continuity with the past, the ones that have inherited the historic institutions of Protestantism. That's why we also consider, like, state churches in Europe to be mainline. We consider the Church of England, the state Anglican Church, to be mainline. We consider the Church of Sweden, the Lutheran Church in Sweden, to be mainline. But over the years, especially in the 20th century, the mainline churches drifted theologically and socially liberal, and a lot of faithful Protestants in those denominations couldn't take it anymore, so they left and formed evangelical offshoots. But the problem was these evangelical offshoots didn't inherit the institutions of the mainline, which is why they're usually not nearly as established. They're not connected to the universities and seminaries and hospitals just like the mainline churches were, and they tend to have ugly buildings and a more contemporary style of worship. So, the real, objective difference between mainline and evangelical is the mainlines are just the old traditional ones, and the evangelical ones are the new ones that were started recently due to the mainline ones, due to the old ones drifting away from the beliefs upon which they were founded. But I think there's an even deeper and perhaps even a more profound difference between the two to what it means to be Christian. The evangelicals have a propositional approach, and the mainliners have a participatory approach. Now, both of these have truth to them, but each side only really focuses on one of them. So, for example, what does it mean to be Reformed, or to be a Presbyterian? Both the PCUSA, the mainline Presbyterian Church, and the PCA, the largest evangelical Presbyterian Church, will claim to be Presbyterian, and will claim to be the rightful heirs of the Reformed Presbyterian tradition. But both of them have completely different ideas about what it means to be Presbyterian. So the evangelical idea of what it means to be Christian, or to be Presbyterian, or to be part of any religious tradition is a lot more straightforward. They believe it's just agreeing with the ideas of that tradition. That's why it's a propositional approach to an identity. It's a propositional approach to religious identity. And even a lot of modern Catholic and Eastern Orthodox young converts still have a fundamentally evangelical mindset to religious identity. You'll find a lot of what I call LARPers. For those of you who are Gen X or Boomers, LARPers stands for live action role player. LARP stands for live action role play. So there's a lot of LARPers who will say they're Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, but they won't really attend a Catholic or Eastern Orthodox church. They will just say that they belong to those churches because they agree with the theologies of those churches. That is a fundamentally evangelical approach to religious identity. That's why I say a lot of American Eastern Orthodoxy is a lot more Protestant influenced than it's willing to admit. Any traditional Catholic or Eastern Orthodox person, or mainline Protestant for that matter, would say that it's not enough to just agree with the beliefs of a religious tradition to be part of that tradition. You have to actually participate in it, and that, of course, starts with attending church in real life. And there's LARPers in Protestantism as well. I'm not just digging at the Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. I'm not just bashing them. A lot of people will say, oh, I attend my parents' non-denominational church, but I'm really a Presbyterian because I agree with Presbyterian theology. You know who you are. I know that there's a lot of people who watch my videos who talk like that, and I tell them, no, you're not a Presbyterian yet. If you don't attend a Presbyterian church, you are a non-denominational who likes Presbyterian theology, but you're not actually a Presbyterian. The evangelical mindset, the evangelical approach to theology, the evangelical approach to religious identity is much more propositional. And of course, I am simplifying it. I am not saying mainline Protestants don't care about ideas or propositional truth. I'm not saying evangelical Protestants don't care about belonging to a community. But generally, evangelicals say you are part of a religious tradition if you agree with the ideas of that religious tradition. And generally, mainline Protestants will say you are part of a religious tradition if you participate in that tradition. So, go to your average PCUSA church. You might want to experiment and try this. I mean, most of you probably won't because, you have other stuff to do. But if you go up to a PCUSA pastor, an average PCUSA pastor, this doesn't apply to all of them because a lot of PCUSA pastors are more conservative, but even the conservative ones I still think would say this. If they ask, okay, you are Presbyterian. Presbyterians are historically Calvinist and Reformed. Are you a Calvinist? The average one will say, oh, well, we're part of the Reformed tradition. But if you really press them, do you agree with all the 5 points of Calvinism? Do you really agree that God predestines some individuals unchangeably to eternal salvation and predestines others to not be saved and passes over the rest? Do you really believe that? The average PCUSA pastor will say, no, I don't believe that. But they will still think they can count as Reformed or Calvinist. Even some of the most liberal ones don't agree with a single thing John Calvin said. They don't agree with any of his ideas at all. They are complete heretics in the eyes of John Calvin, but they will still call themselves Calvinists because they are participating in his religious tradition, because they are the ones that have continuity in their community with the communities that John Calvin was in. So it's sort of like they see belonging to a religious tradition as belonging to a country. Of course, France has drastically changed in its ideologies over the centuries, but we would still say it's France. We would still say a person is just as much French as a person in France would be 1,000 years ago, even though they had completely different ideas. So the mainline Protestant understanding of what a religious tradition is sort of like a country. So, from the mainline Protestant perspective, a liberal PCUSA pastor who agrees with 0% of Reformed theology would be more Reformed than some evangelical non-denominational theology nerd who agrees with 100% of Reformed theology, but for whatever reason does not actually attend a Reformed Presbyterian church in real life. Because the mainline understanding of religious truth is participatory rather than propositional. And of course, there's generalizations. I know more than anyone else. There are mainline PCUSA pastors who are conservative, both socially and theologically, who don't support gay marriage, gay ordination, women pastors, and who believe in traditional Calvinism. That does exist in the PCUSA, but it's a minority. And of course, I know that there are evangelicals who say that being Christian is more than just agreeing with the ideas of Christianity. You actually have to participate in a community. This is an oversimplification. That's what it is. And you see the fruits of that. So, because mainline Protestant churches really emphasize the participatory and communal aspect of the faith, but not so much the propositional aspect of the faith, you will see mainline churches being a lot more conservative than evangelical ones in terms of their style. They're a lot more concerned with having a style of worship that looks like what historic Christianity looks like. That's why contemporary worship, CCM, contemporary style liturgy, is way more rare in mainline churches than in evangelical churches. Most liberal PCUSA churches are extremely trad in their worship style because their approach to religion is participatory. You need to be participating in the same traditions that people have throughout the centuries, even if you don't actually believe the beliefs the traditions were founded upon. The same way the average French person, if you can call French people, the average French person participates in the same traditions, in some sense, in a lot of the same traditions at least, that French people of 500 years ago participated in, even though they probably have completely different values from French people of 500 years ago. That's how mainline Protestants generally see their denominations. So that's why mainline Protestants will call people like, I don't know, Jürgen Moltmann Reformed. Jürgen Moltmann, his theology, his actual doctrine, is less reformed than Jay Dyer, less reformed than a traditional Eastern Orthodox person. Now, I'm not saying everything about Jürgen Moltmann is bad, but his theology departs in so many ways from traditional Reformed theology. He's one of those, he's on the liberal end of neo-Orthodoxy, in my opinion. He's so close to heresy, and in some sense you could call him a heretic, I think. But in mainline circles, Jürgen Moltmann would be considered Reformed because he participates in the Reformed tradition, because he's part of the German Reformed churches. I know a lot of mainline people who would consider Jürgen Moltmann even more Reformed than a conservative PCA pastor. Why is that? Well, because the PCA propositionally holds to Reformed theology, but they sort of did separate themselves from the Reformed community when they split off from the mainline due to the mainline going too liberal. And in some sense, that's true. In some sense, I think the PCA and all the other conservative offshoots were wrong to split off, because they did separate themselves from the Reformed community, and they did lose an aspect of the Reformed identity that is irreplaceable. That's why I'm for Reconquista. I'm for retaking the mainline. So, the reason so many people are converting to Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy is that today, in those traditions, you have both the propositional and participatory aspect of those traditions. Your average Roman Catholic Church holds to the traditions of Catholicism, is in communion with all the other Catholic churches throughout history, but also agrees with Catholic theology. The same is true of your average Eastern Orthodox church. But in your average Protestant church, it's kind of one or the other. If you go to a mainline Protestant, Presbyterian PCUSA church, you will find so much external Reformed tradition. You will find, pictures of Reformed ministers throughout the centuries plastered on the walls. You will find, creeper. Okay, that creeper destroyed most of my pumpkin farm. I'm glad I made some pumpkin seeds before he did that. And that creeper was probably sent by the PCA. Okay, there's some more pumpkin seeds here. But if you go to PCUSA Church, you will find so much Reformed heritage just in the church, on the walls, in the liturgy, everywhere. But where you will not find Reformed heritage is in the actual doctrines of what people are teaching. Generally, what is going to be taught in the PCUSA Church is going to more closely resemble Unitarian Universalism than anything historically Reformed or Presbyterian. And once again, I know very well that there are many exceptions to this. I have a whole map of exceptions to this. Actually, I have two maps. One of the maps is just historic churches regardless of which specific denomination they're in, as long as they're historic Protestant churches. And my other map is specifically conservative mainline churches regardless of whether they have a traditional style. People often confuse my two maps, and, that's understandable. I don't expect people to keep track of all the little projects I do all the time. But yeah, basically, in a PCUSA mainline Presbyterian church, the same is true for the mainline versions of other denominations. In United Methodist Church, you will find tons of heritage in that church. You will not find the theological heritage of that church that preached on a Sunday morning. That's what you will not find. And that likely is what you will find in an evangelical church. If you go to a PCA church, or for Anglicans, if you go to an ACNA church, you will find the theology of those traditions faithfully preached, most likely. Now, of course, I don't think the PCA is perfect in its theology, because I think they have had a heavy Baptist evangelical influence, but it's miles better theologically than the average PCUSA church, which is hardly even Christian in its theology, let alone Presbyterian. And of course, there's exceptions, as I said a million times in this video. Now, if you go to an evangelical church, yes, you will find that theology, but you won't find as much of the heritage. These evangelical offshoot denominations are disconnected both aesthetically and institutionally from their own heritage. That's why the vast majority of PCA churches look and sound very contemporary. And yes, I know this because I have actually looked at every single PCA church and I calculated how many of them have a traditional style. The number is 14%. 14% of PCA churches have a traditional style. The rest are contemporary. And 14% of the PCA, that's still like 212 churches. There's still like over 200 PCA churches that are solid and traditional. But there is a right stereotype that the average evangelical church is not traditional in its style. So you won't find as much of the outward heritage. So part of it is because they just don't have the resources. They became a lot more poor when they split off from the main line. They lost their resources. But part of it is because evangelicalism just has a different approach to what it means to be the church. The evangelical approach, because it's so propositional, they think theology and what doctrines you preach from the pulpit, that's really all that has great importance. And the style of worship or the institutional connections of the church, that is like not even secondary. That's like tertiary or quaternary at best for them. It's like, yes, I agree that at the end of the day, doctrine is more important than aesthetics. But at the same time, aesthetics convey this larger idea of belonging to this tradition that's larger than yourself, and belonging to the tradition includes more than simply ideas. It includes more than simply propositions. It also includes to institutional connections and pretty buildings and beautiful music. That's just the fruits of institutional connections. So when I was struggling with my denominational identity, not recently, this was like in 2018 when I was first learning about Calvinism, I was struggling with whether to be a Calvinist, and I was listening to two different voices. I was listening to both PCUSA Presbyterians in my own church and PCA Presbyterians like Tim Keller. Of course, the people I was listening to from my own church, I was listening to them in real life, and Tim Keller I was listening to just online. I was listening to his sermons and stuff, and both were massively helpful for me, and both were massively formative on me. And ever since then, I've always been stuck between two worlds. I've always been stuck between mainline and evangelical. So what I've learned to do is I've learned to value both the propositional and the participatory aspects of being in the faith. So that means I don't exactly feel at home in any mainline or evangelical churches. So that I've always just been stuck between these two worlds. When I would ask my PCUSA mentors what it means to be Presbyterian and Reformed, they wouldn't say you have to agree with all 5 points of Calvinism. Some of them did believe all 5 points of Calvinism, but they would say it's just being part of the Reformed tradition. It's just being part of this community. And because mainline churches have that participatory aspect, but not the propositional aspect, you can be a full member of a mainline Presbyterian church and not agree with any Presbyterian theology, not even agree with any Christian theology in many cases. Whereas, for an evangelical church, yes, they do have the propositional theology down. Most PCA churches are good at catechizing their members, good at preaching good doctrine on a Sunday morning, but they really don't care what the worship style of the church is like. I've heard stories of PCA churches turning down the opportunity to have a beautiful building because it would be too much of a schlep to maintain. Like, how little do you care about your own religious heritage? Seriously, that is not okay. And of course, it's not quite as bad as preaching heresy from the pulpit. Yeah, I'm aware of that. But because when I was learning about the Reformed tradition and when I was struggling with my denominational identity, I was taught and I was mentored by both mainline and evangelical people. So ever since then, I've just been stuck between those two worlds, and the only way to resolve my own cognitive dissonance was with Reconquista, was trying to achieve the best of both worlds, to try and make the mainline churches also care about propositional truth. And although I think it's a lot harder to make the evangelical churches care about the participatory identity because they've severed themselves from the institutions, there's not much they can do about that, there's no reason they shouldn't try. I am very pessimistic about what evangelicals can do in their denominations to really make them more traditional, because tradition is something that needs to age like a fine wine. It takes a long time to build up. Whereas changing the beliefs of a denomination actually tends to happen really rapidly. It only takes like one generation, whereas it takes centuries to build up this sense of tradition and community and heritage. You can't just manufacture that out of thin air. So when I say we should make the PCUSA more conservative, and people say, why not just make the PCA more traditional? It's like, you can't just manufacture tradition. That's like trying to build a 300-year-old house, like now. I mean, that's what young Earth creationists think happened with Adam in the Garden of Eden, but even so, you can't just do that. But even so, I still think it would be helpful for Christians in evangelical offshoots, like the PCA, or the EPC or ECO, or the ACNA, to start having more of a participatory approach to what it means to be part of the Reformed tradition. So I guess my bottom line would be this. Being part of a religious tradition is more than just agreeing with their ideas. It's also about being part of a community and part of a heritage. And for that, you should be in a church that is not just any church, but a church that is as interconnected as possible. So that means either join a mainline church or a church that is part of some historic denomination, but do not join a non-denominational church, because in such places you are not participating in anything other than that local congregation. So that's why I'm against non-denominationalism. Anyway, I'm going to speed this up while I do some more work on my church, and I will see you guys later.